18.5 Underemployment and the Phillips curve. As we saw in Chapter 5, underemployment has become an increasingly significant component of labor utilization in many nations over the last 2 decades. In some nations, such as Australia, the rise in unemployment has outstripped the fall in official unemployment. National statistical agencies have responded to these trends by publishing more regular updates of unemployment. They have also constructed new data series to provide broader measures of labor wastage. For example, the Australian Bureau of Statistics Broad Labor Underutilization Series, which is published on a quarterly basis, after the major recession that has beset many nations in the early 1990s, unemployment fell as growth gathered pace. At the same time, inflation also moderated, and this led economists to increasingly question the practical utility of the concept of the cyclical invariant natural rate or NAVR for policy purposes. Excuse me. Quite apart from the conceptual disagreement, this skepticism was reinforced because various agencies produced estimates of the natural rate of unemployment that declined steadily throughout the 1990s as the unemployment rate fell. As the unemployment rate went below each natural rate estimate and inflation continued to fall, new estimates of the natural rate were produced, which showed it had fallen further. This reinforces our conclusion that NAVRU estimates have no predictive capacity in relation to the movements between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. The question then arises as to why the unemployment rate and the inflation rate both fell in many nations during the 1990s. Also, what does this mean for the Phillips curve? To understand this more fully, economists started to focus on the concept of the excess supply of labor, which is a key variable constraining wage and price changes in the Phillips curve framework. The standard Phillips curve approach predicts a statistically significant negative coefficient on the official unemployment rate, a proxy for excess demand. However, the hysteresis model suggests that state dependence is positively related to unemployment duration, and at some point, long-term unemployed cease to exert any threat to those currently employed. Consequently, they do not discipline the wage demands of those in work and do not influence inflation. The hidden unemployed are even more distant from the wage-setting process, so we might expect that short-term unemployment is a better excess demand proxy in the inflation-adjusted function than is the overall unemployment rate. That includes long-term unemployed. While the short-term unemployed may be proximate enough to the wage-setting process to influence price movements, there is another significant and even more proximate source of surplus labor available to employees to condition wage bargaining: the underemployed. The underemployed represents an untapped pool of additional working hours that could be redistributed among a smaller pool of persons in a relatively costless fashion of employers so desired. It is thus reasonable to hypothesize that the underemployed pose a viable threat to those in full-time work who might be better placed to set the wage norms in the economy. This argument is consistent with research in the literature that shows that the wages determination is dominated by insiders, the employed, who set up barriers to isolate themselves from the threat of unemployment. Phillips curve studies have found within firm excess demand for those for labor variables such as the rate of capacity utilization or rate of overtime to be more significant and disciplining the wage determination process that external excess demand proxies such as the unemployment rate. It is plausible that while the short-term unemployed still pose a more latent threat than the short-term unemployed, the unemployed are also likely to be considered an effective surplus labor pool. In that case, we might expect downward pressure on price inflation to emerge from both these sources of excess labor. As an example, the relationship between the unemployed rate and inflation in Australia. Between 1978 and 2015, this sample is split into three subsamples. The first, from March 78 to September 83, is defined by starting point of the most recent consistent labor force data series in 78 and the peak unemployment rate from 82 recession and 83. The second period, December 83 to December 83 rather to September 93, depicts the recovery phase in 1980s and then the period into the unemployment peak that followed the 91 recession. The final period goes from December 93 to September 2015. The solid lines are simple linear trend regression. The relationship between the annual inflation rate and the unemployment rate clearly shifted after the 91 recession, focusing on the dashed arrow line joining September 95 and September 97. This was a period when the Phillips curve began to flatten and move inwards. Over 3 years, the unemployment rate was stuck due to a lack of aggregate demand growth, but the inflation rate was falling. This has been explained in part by the fall in inflationary expectations. The 91 recession was particularly severe and led to a sharp drop in the annual inflation rate with a decline in survey-based inflationary expectations. The other major labor market development that arose from the 91 recession was the sharp increase and then persistent of high unemployment. Firms shed full-time jobs and as the recovery got underway began to replace the full-time jobs that were shed with part-time opportunities. Even though employment growth gathered pace in the late 1990s, a majority of those jobs in Australia were part-time. Further, the part-time jobs were increasingly of a casual nature. Figure 18.8 shows the relationship between the unemployment and inflation in Australia from 1978 to 2015. It also shows the relationship between the underemployment estimates provided by the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the annual inflation rate for the same period. The equations shown on the simple regression depicted graphically by the solid lines. The graph suggests the negative relationship between inflation and underemployment and stronger than the relationship between inflation and unemployment. More detailed econometric analysis confirms this to be the case. The inclusion of unemployment in Phillips curve specification helps explain why low rates of unemployment were not inflationary in the period leading up to the GFC. It suggests that changes in the way that labor market operates, while more classical work and underemployment have been significant in explaining the impact of the labor market on wage inflation and general price level inflation. Conclusion. In this chapter, we reviewed three theories of inflation determination, namely the Phillips curve, trade Well, trade-off the expectations augmented Phillips curve and the hysteresis model of the Phillips curve trade-off. We have shown that the expectations augmented Phillips curve specification rejected the capacity of Keynesian aggregate demand management to achieve sustainable cuts in unemployment under the monetarist assumption that the coefficient and the inflation expectation variable was unity. The empirical evidence has shown that the concept of cyclically invariance neighbor, which underpins the monetarist policy prescription. Also, the empirical estimates of the neighbor are related to the lagged unemployment rather than any structural features of the economy which are alleged to impact on the sustainable rate of unemployment or neighbor. On the other hand, the hysteretic model of inflation has shown that total unemployment is inadequate proxy for excess demand in the inflation model. Researchers need to differentiate between short-term and long-term unemployment and also incorporate underemployment into their excess demand proxy. The changes in composition of unemployment over the business cycle explains why the macroequilibrium rate of unemployment or MRU is cyclically sensitive, which gives rise to the phenomenon known as hysteresis. Both the Phillips curve trade-off and the hysteretic model are consistent with stimulatory policy leading to lower unemployment, albeit with higher rate of inflation. And that'll do it for today. Stay tuned as I continue on with reading different chapters. I'll just say that. Thanks for being here. Please subscribe. Please like, comment, hit that notification bell, and share. And go to rootprogressives.org. Peace out for now.